Welcome to another episode of Out of the Blank podcast. I'm here with Russell and Brad Parker. You guys are researchers in the medical evidence, and for a lot of people like myself, I don't know what the heck's going on with the medical evidence. Mostly, Kennedy's brain's gone. I guess that's just well accepted amongst everybody, is that we just don't know where that is, and it's kind of like one of those weird things you toss out now, which is like, yeah, we just don't know where that is. But if you guys would like to introduce yourselves, Brad, we'll start with you, and then Russell will go into you.
My name is Brad Parker. I was very active in the Kennedy research community in the mid to late 90s into about 2004, 2005. I had a book come out in, I believe it was 2003, at the suggestion of Deborah Conway, who was the publisher at JFK Lancer. I had spent most of my time up until that point, and even the work that I did, any work that I did subsequent to that, was with the Parkland trauma team, the interviewing the physicians who were there, anybody I could get a hold of who was there. And really that just was the physicians. I wasn't able to interview any nurses because those were very young nurses and a lot of them changed their names when they got married and therefore they were difficult to locate. That's kind of my area of focus.
Yeah, I'm Russell Kent. I started in the case about the same time as Brad, maybe a little earlier, in the early 90s. And I've always been interested in medical evidence. That's my background is in physiology. And so I just thought it was the area of the case that I could understand. And it's the area that I found most intriguing. And it certainly is one of the most intriguing areas. Covers two lots of hospital personnel and beyond that into the various review bodies that looked at the medical evidence. And that's what my book, JFK Medical Evidence, JFK Medical Betrayal, concentrates on, the different review panels. So I've been, in the last sort of 5 years, very deep into those review panels and the various doctors on those panels, rather than looking individually at Parkland or Bethesda hospitals. So my knowledge is not quite as current as Brad's is, but I'm sure we'll have a happy discourse now. And thanks for having me on.
You mentioned two lots. Now, I don't know if you guys would know this, but with Parkland Hospital, it wasn't just Parkland, right? There was another hospital attached to it. There was two different ones, if I'm not mistaken.
Zale-Lipsey Hospital. There was also a children's hospital, I believe. It was the medical school was located there. UT Southwestern Medical School at Dallas was the name of it. And Parkland was the primary teaching hospital, but because you want your medical students exposed to as many types of cases as possible, there were multiple specialty hospitals on site that they could go to further their education.
Now, was it well known that there was issues at Parkland Hospital? I don't know when you guys decided, or when you guys even first looked into the medical evidence, were you guys aware that there were problems at Parkland Hospital? But I was wondering when that information came out, because when it's something like that, especially with medical stuff, the Kennedy family has been pretty private about a lot of the information. It seems like it's been very hard to understand what exactly has been going on. But when it comes to the information at Parkland, the issues with Earl Rose and subsequent other trauma, wounds, all these types of things, I'm wondering when all that information was more publicly known. Was it based on interviews with people, or did that information just slowly leak out over the years?
I believe those issues were possibly broached by Mark Lane in Rush to Judgment. I don't think it's been any secret. Now, Parkland itself and the medical school had an absolutely stellar reputation. It was probably the premier medical school outside of the Ivy League, and it was cranking out people who were staying at Parkland. So there were no problems until November 22nd, 1963. And, I've interviewed Dr. Rose and I found out some new stuff on Dr. Rose just actually overnight. But those issues are not new by any means.
Brad, I'd add that the whole controversy actually started on the day, on the 22nd, when the the press interviews that went on in Parkland itself. So when Malcolm Perry said that the shot appeared to come from the front, and of course that was the opposite of what the government was saying from day one too. So those sort of controversies happened straight away, and I imagine between the publication of Mark Lane's book as well, there were various leaks coming from the Warren Commission. Medical evidence seemed to be opposite to what the physicians at Parkland have been saying.
I want to get into some of the problems at Parkland, but what would you guys say is the importance or significance of Parkland? And then maybe we can go into when a limo arrived and Kennedy's taken out of the limousine and brought into trauma room 1.
The significance of that's pretty broad. What I would say is, they had Baylor University Medical Center, Dallas, and they had Parkland, and those were the two trauma centers in Dallas. But Baylor became a much better trauma center under the guidance of Ron Jones, who was actually at Parkland on November 22nd. In the 70s, he took over the surgical department at Baylor and really turned them into a trauma center. But if he'd been going the other way, if the car had been going the other way and they would have ended up at Baylor, I think people would have said, oh, he probably died of malpractice, because Baylor did not have a good reputation. Parkland was the stellar place to go. And of course, then everything from, the doctor's statements to the Earl Rose incident to, Governor Connally's injuries, those kinds of things. Those are all sort of the significance of Parkland in the grand scheme of the case. If that answers what you're asking.
I totally back that up, Brad. It was definitely the trauma center in the south of the US, possibly in the whole of the US. And I don't know if you know this, but there is a handbook, the Parkland Trauma Handbook. So they literally wrote the book on trauma.
They wrote the book on trauma. They did.
So was there anyone in their experience that would be able to handle the situation when it comes to wounds that Kennedy was dealing with?
I
believe nothing would have helped, but I'm still saying, just because based on, obviously you're still trying to save somebody's life. Until you're pronounced dead, you're not legally dead. So they're going to do everything they possibly can until someone pronounces them. So I'm just wondering if the situation, the whole kind of, people can call it a show, but working on Kennedy trying to save his life.
From the time he was struck at 12:30 until 12:52, he was exhibiting a clear and strong heartbeat. Of course, at that point, the heart is essentially on autopilot, because the brain is the portion of the brain that controls that is undamaged. But pretty much everything else was. There was that wound was not survivable. That wound could have been inflicted today in an emergency room, and the person is still going to die. It was that catastrophic. That their chief of surgery was out of town that day. He was in Galveston, but it wouldn't have made any difference if the greatest physician who ever lived was on scene. It was a non-survivable wound.
Yes, it was. And although his heart was still beating, there was so much blood coming from the head wound. He had no blood pressure. So that means that no blood was going anywhere else in the body. They even tried lifting the feet of the foot of the bed that he was on. The foot he was on was lifted to try and increase the blood pressure, but they just couldn't get a blood pressure. So, like Brad said, he was always going to die from that wound. But when you've got the head of state in your trauma room, you do everything you can. You do everything you can to try and help him. I don't think they would have done any less for any other patient. But of course, more people arrived on the scene probably than would have been there for any other patient.
So when he arrives and they put him in trauma room 1 and they're examining the wounds, who was there, if you guys want to give like a brief, and then when it comes to wounds as well too, because there's a lot of discrepancies with the medical evidence. So I'm just wondering who saw what. I've looked at the statements of like everybody, and I've seen actually more people than I thought talk about a back hole in the back of his head, which is interesting because I always thought it was like one or two, but it seemed like there was a well acceptance of just like there was this wound in the back of the head.
Well, he arrived. He shot at 12:30. Arrives at about 12:35, and they immediately have a problem. And that Jackie knows he's dead, and Jackie says, "Leave him alone. Let me have this time with him. He's gone." She won't let go of him, and so there's this moment of what do we do to get the president out of the car? Because she's not letting him go. Got the governor out, so we can now get Kennedy out, but now she won't let him go. So Clint Hill actually took off his suit jacket and put it over the president's head. That way, it kind of seemed to me that Jackie did not want people to see him in that condition. So, but at the car already from 12:35 to 12:38, Jim Carrico, who was a first year or no, second year resident in surgery, he was known as the pit boss that day. Which the pit was the emergency department. He and Dr. Bill Midget were at the car, and they were the first physicians to actually see him. Now, obviously, when they're trying to get him away from Jackie, there's not much they can do. They do notice she's cyanotic. In other words, she is slightly blue. He's trying to breathe. And regardless of the extent of the head injury, if you've got somebody trying to breathe, there's a chance. So they remove him from the car, get him inside. More help is called for. Midget he ends up in the emergency room for a short time. And then I believe he directed his attention to Governor Connally while Dr. Shaw, the thoracic surgeon, was paged. Carrico claimed that what he saw was this, and what he told me was he never saw the back of the head. The way he put it to me was most of that injury was on the downside. But then he claims that he believes the Warren report. But we never saw that injury. So I put in the endotracheal tube. That wasn't working. Malcolm Perry arrives with Charles Baxter, two of the four faculty members they have in surgery. And Dr. Malcolm Perry decides it's tracheotomy time. So they start tracheotomy. At that point, Dr. Ron Jones has arrived, Dr. Richard Delaney. I believe Marty White was also there. They did see a tiny hole that just clipped the tie as it came through. They start the tracheotomy, but a limited number of people saw that injury prior to the incision that Dr. Perry made. At that moment, Dr. Charles Crenshaw and Dr. Robert McClelland arrive in the room. McClelland is handed an Army-Navy retractor, which to me he called the idiot stick. His job is to hold that open. Now, what he said that doesn't take any particular amount of attention to do that. So he's holding the retractor to keep this throat open. Well, he's also kind of looking down. And as he does, he sees a portion of the cerebellum, which is a dark gray, convoluted material, fall out on the table. The cerebellum is located essentially as now Russell could give a better description of this, but if you draw a line across the back of your head between your ear canals, basically everything below that is cerebellum. So if the cerebellum's falling out, you've got a very low hole in the back of the head. That's what we have for injuries when he arrives at Parkland.
Yeah, it's a very good description. I, from my studies, I know that Carrico was the first doctor to meet him on the gurney. He also checked his eyeballs to see his pupil dilation. When he took him into the trauma room, lots of people started to arrive. And really what the trauma team does is the ABCs of trauma. This is covered in my book. A for airway, which is, of course, what Carrico did. First thing he did was intubate. And then B for breathing. So you attach to a breathing machine. So you've got the breathing going. And then C for circulation. And that's essentially what all the other doctors were doing, except for Perry, was making sure that there were enough fluids going into his body to replace the blood he was losing. And of course, Brad's quite right about the cerebellum. It's very low in the back of the head. It's essentially what the occipital bone in the skull covers. It protects it. So as Brad said, if there's cerebellum coming out of that wound, then the wound has to be in the occipital area, at least partially in the occipital area. And Carrico did say that he saw cerebellum, and I think this is one of the points I would make is that the Warren report, poor as it is, actually does contain an appendix with all the admission notes from the doctors. Well, I say all of them, a few of them. The admission notes were written on the day. Carrico wrote his at 16:20 on the day, 4:20 in the afternoon. So, only a few hours after he'd experienced all of this. And he mentioned cerebellum in that. And you can read it I'm just looking now, I've got the Warren report right next to me. It's on page 519 in the Warren report.
Should throw that in the fireplace.
Yeah, this particular copy, it's probably worth $140 or so. So probably not going to throw that one in the fire, Fred.
And I would just add that on page 530 of that volume, you will find Dr. Jenkins referring to the cerebellum as well.
Yeah, in fact, I mean, most of them did. And of course, the most important person in that respect would be Kemp Clark, who was the doctor of neurosurgery. And he mentioned cerebellum. So the important thing about cerebellum is it's easily definable and discernible from other brain tissue. So the cerebrum, which is the most of the brain, the largest part of the brain, has these folds in it, which is called sulci, and they're quite broad. And I've dissected brains, so I know this, and they can be as broad as sort of 2 fingers broad. Whereas the sulci on the cerebellum, which is a definable different part of the brain, about the size of your fist at the back here, the sulci are very narrow. And so you can easily tell the difference between the 2 types of brain tissue. And every doctor in there would have known the difference between the tissue that was falling out of his head. There was some cerebrum, which was the larger folds, and there was definitely some cerebellum. They all said so.
Now, what's the significance of them seeing cerebellum? When it comes to at least the official narrative, I think that's where we kind of get lost. I think the importance of Parkland is that there was cerebellum and all this that these doctors saw.
If you go with the lone gunman theory and you buy the autopsy result, or the results of the autopsy report, rather, there's no place in that report for cerebellum to be visible. The wound does not extend that far back as was observed in Dallas. The wound stopped. Well, we don't want to get into my bald spot here, but it doesn't go back far enough to allow for cerebellum to be observed.
That's right. I mean, the doctors describe it as I'll have to use the medical measuring term, 70 millimeter hole, which would be, about the size of a small orange, this kind of size, I guess. About 70 millimeters in its greatest diameter, some of which had to be in the occipital area for cerebellum to fall out. Now, a wound that large can only be described really as an exit wound. It's not typical. Entrance wounds are typically small. Exit wounds are typically large. So if this is going to be an exit wound on the back of his head, then the shooting had to come from the front. Of course, that is not where Lee Harvey Oswald was at the time.
Now, who's the most trusted statements that you look at when it comes to Parkland Hospital? You mentioned Carrico, but I think Brad, you mentioned that he might have said something different to you.
Jericho, very, very nice individual, but made it very clear that he was. I spoke to him at about the time. I spoke to him in July of '92. That was about the time Posner's book was coming out, and the JAMA articles had just come out in May of uh, 1992, and in those articles, Journal of the American Medical Association, May, I believe that's twice monthly. It's either May or June or both May. Those issues interviewed fresh contemporary interviews with Carrico, Jenkins, Perry, McClellan. They also interviewed Humes, Boswell, and Fink. But those interviews do not coincide with what they initially said. So those people that changed their mind, McClellan didn't really say enough in that article to change his mind. And Dr. McClellan is absolutely one of my favorite witnesses. He is rock solid on everything he said through the years. Now, his opinion changed. Initially when it happens, he sort of goes, wow, okay, I guess he was shot from the rear. It doesn't make sense to me, but I'm not in that position, so whatever. Then he sees the Zapruder film in 1969 through the Clay Shaw deal, and his opinion kept becoming stronger that the wound came from the front or the side. The other one that I would bet the house on, bet the farm on, whatever you want to bet, is Ron Jones. Ron Jones is as solid a witness as you're going to find, and I believe he's the only one left, other than maybe Salyer. Those guys are, you can look at their reports that day. You can look at their testimony. Now, the testimony is difficult to look at because they're being given leading questions. But the interviews that they did for other researchers, I believe they maybe did some for Mark Lane, Josiah Thompson, David Lifton. Those people are absolutely solid. Excuse me, I seem to have a bit of a fly problem, which is the name of an Elvis bootleg. But no, those are two of my absolute favorite witnesses. Jackie Hunt is another one that if you read her testimony, she indicates she sees the face, does not indicate she saw a wound. What she told me in February of '93 was that her impression, now she leaned over the top messing with anesthesia equipment because she's an anesthesiologist assisting Dr. Jenkins. But her position was, my impression was exactly what McClellan drew for Josiah Thompson in 1966, which is the back of the head being gone. And she's another of my favorites there. And I'll give it to Russell to name his favorites there.
Sure, thank you. Yeah, I mean, these characters far better than I do, and I've looked at their. You've interviewed them, so you're in a stronger position than me. What I would say is that very many of them, their positions changed over the years, and you can understand why, because although they were there at the time, their opinions are coloured when they're asked certain questions at press conferences, and then they're asked the leading questions that Brad talked about at the Warren Commission. And when everybody else is saying, he was shot from behind and this kid Oswald did it, it takes guts to stand out and say, no, that's not true. And not only does it take guts, but it takes some that you're risking your position, if you like. You're risking your professional position in taking an opposing position to the government. especially when you're a professor at a medical school. The funding very often comes from the government in the States. And so you have to be careful about what you say publicly. I would say that one of my favourites would be another nurse, Margaret Henchliff. She was pretty solid with the Warren Commission, I thought. And Brad, you'll have to remind me, was it her that Harry Livingston interviewed later on? And there was one other nurse. I think it was Harry, wasn't it?
I believe so, but it's been so long since I read the Livingston books.
Yeah, I mean, me too. But my connection with that is that I got his tapes, his interview tapes. Um, they were left to a British researcher over here, Malcolm Blunt, and he had a box of them, and he gave them to me, and he said, take what you need, and I found the tapes where he'd interviewed this nurse. I think it was Margaret Henchliff. Of course, she changed her name and she'd moved countries. So that's why they're so difficult to track down. But she stuck to her story. Yeah, she stuck to what she saw. But having changed names, married, and moved countries, of course, she got little to risk. So anyway, yeah, the nurses were good to me, and yet they didn't write admission notes, and they weren't very often interviewed.
I didn't want to dance around the question here, but now that we're getting into it, it's the more critical aspect of Parkland Hospital. The changing statements that some of these doctors had, do you believe that was because maybe they didn't want to think what they saw was real? Because here's the issue. When you're looking at these statements from them on their original day, and then compared to what my generation is going to do is look up video interviews or look up things that are more recent. We would look at the more recent things that they said, just so that's probably the best information. Just like with the HSCA, you look at that over the Warren Commission. It's a later investigation. Now it does fit our opinion, but when it comes to the statements of people, if you can find an oral history interview, more people are going to look at that rather than their statement from like the 60s. So when they see that the statement has changed, my generation and other people that are new to the case that are looking at this are going to say, oh, then they must have recalled differently. They must have just been, wrong when they initially stated something. But in this situation, you have to look at the first statements because I think everything at Parkland is probably more accurate than when it goes later. It's the same thing Earl Rose talked about, that he needed to do the autopsy there because if it goes any farther, it's going to lead to conspiracies and there's going to be a bunch of controversies. It needs to be done there at that situation so we can get this all tied together, wrapped up. So that's the same thing that happens when the body gets transferred to Bethesda and everything like that. But when we stick with Parkland, a lot of those initial descriptions of wounds, what was going on in the hospital, that's probably more 100% accurate and not influenced by anything. Now, Russell, if you examine Parkland Hospital and the changing statements later, we can get into the funding for the hospital. A lot of these doctors realizing they have a job, they have a career. If they speak out something like as controversial as this, they could lose their job, they could lose all that. That's a heavy influence. And also, Brad, from our conversations, it's a hectic hospital. There's a lot going on. These doctors are performing to the best of their ability and they're recalling things. Some of their statements, one woman, nurse, she talked about that she went to go get something out of a medical cabinet for Kennedy and realized it wasn't there. Now, if you stop there, that gets really conspiracy. You're like, oh my God, someone had taken the thing that they need. But then she goes, oh, then I realized it was over there on the table. Someone else must have grabbed it. So it's like, okay, there's not conspiracy there. They're just even when they're giving their interviews, they're giving you exact detail. And some of it doesn't seem relevant, but it's actually pretty important for the historical record. So there's obviously two influencing factors. I'm sure there's many more. But when we talk about the accurate statements and the doctors changing statements later, in your opinion, where do you put more weight, whether it's influence from something of like, this is the official narrative, or just the hecticness that was going on at the hospital at the time?
I think there are a number of factors that contribute to that. I believe that probably the best source on anything were things that Russell mentioned earlier, where that collection of admission notes done that day or in a couple cases done the very next day. Then you have volume 6 of the Warren Commission report, or the Warren Commission hearings, rather, and those contained depositions. And in some of those depositions, some stuff got through, which is a little bit surprising. But they were also being questioned by Mr. Spector, who was giving them these hypothetical scenarios. Now, if a bullet does this and it meets this criteria and all this, could it possibly have looked like that? Well, you're pinning the doctor to where doctors don't do hypotheticals. They treat what's in front of them, but they have to answer the question. So they say, well, I guess so. Um, Later, you get into some things like some of the books that came out in the 60s, whether it be, and I don't remember if Tink Thompson talked to any of the doctors or not. I believe Mark Lane did. I tend to go with their early statements and then see, does their statement to Bob Groden in 1989, or, to me in 2002 or 1992, does that line up? If it doesn't, there's a problem. Several of them, Dr. Ken Salyer was one. I sent him a drawing of the wound, and he redrew the wound. You've seen that. I think that's in the first episode that I was on. So I don't necessarily say the current statements are wrong. I try to compare them to the original statement, and if they're drastically different, okay, they're different for whatever reason. Maybe the guy got tired of his phone ringing every night. Maybe he just wants to be left alone. Maybe somebody came to him and said, hey, shut up about this. This is what you're going to say if you say anything at all. I mean, because the Secret Service did visit Parkland that weekend, and they gathered all the trauma team together, and they were told, you are not to talk about this, except to investigators. And a lot of them, fortunately, did not abide by that. But, I think different people had different reasons for changing their minds. Some of them, memories can evolve over time. I mean, you ever get those people that tell a story so many times that they've heard that they actually sort of insert themselves in the story, and then your mind can evolve, or your memory will evolve. But it's the ones that are solid, like McClellan, like Jones, like Hunt. Hunt made a statement in the 70s to the Boston Globe, which lines up perfectly with what she told me. Those are the really good ones, I think. But you're talking about people of, say, your generation, that they want everything in a soundbite, essentially, and they're not going to go back and look at volume 6. They're not going to go back to the HSCA, and unfortunately, they're going to see a lot of clips of a lot of doctors saying things which don't line up with what they said in 1964.
So I haven't made clips at Parkland Hospital yet because there's no way you can compact that into a minute.
We may be able to talk about some stuff that way, but go ahead, Russell.
Yeah, I mean, I just back you up completely. I think the most reliable accounts are in those admission records, admission notes that they wrote on the day or the day after. And then the next most reliable are probably their replies to the Warren Commission, because it was, it was within a few months of the actual event, when perhaps they'd not been swayed quite as much as they were by the 1970s, when the HSCA interviewed them very late in the day. And of course, they were asked several questions by the Warren Commission along the lines of, well, could it have been an exit? Talking about the throat wound. Well, if something's going through very slowly, yes, it could have been an exit. And so they answered as honestly as they could while maintaining their professional integrity, I think.
Something I wanted to mention, because you've mentioned this when we talk about the ABCs, the airway. you guys have explained it separately to me in private episodes about they were treating a patient, not as if this was like a murder case or if this was something of preserving evidence. But is that normal procedure to find an existing wound or something like that and then open it up even more? Because that's what a lot of people give criticism to Parkland about, is the fact that they put this trach tube down in a pre-existing hole, which would mess up if it was an entrance or an exit. So now we're relying on statements.
With pure luck that the hole was at the right place in the throat. Now, I've done tracheostomies. I know how they go. And it just happened to be in the right place. And it meant that less cutting was required. So Perry only had to extend the hole by a few millimeters each side to be able to get his cuffed tube in. So that was the obvious place to do it. You wouldn't do it above or below it when you've got a hole in the right place. It certainly wouldn't have changed the character of that wound, because a scalpel cut 2 or 3 millimeters each side would just be that. It would just extend the hole each side with a clean cut, which would not look like a bullet wound. A bullet wound typically has rubbed entrances, which give it a kind of, they call it necrosis. There's a burnt area around the bullet hole, which would easily be discernible to anybody with good forensic pathology experience. That's certainly one of the points that Cyril Wecht makes.
So it just became a problem later when we're trying to examine what wounds Kennedy had. I mean, we could examine his clothing, but even that was sent away. The tie and everything, his jacket and everything. So it makes it very hard to tell. I mean, you're examining what, because you see the autopsy photos. Obviously, a lot of the doctors that talked about seeing a back wound or this hole in the back of the head, you look at the autopsy photos that came later. I don't know what you say to that when you're like, I guess I must have imagined this portion of skull that was missing in the back. But when you're looking at like the stuff that we're able to see now, where the hole in the jacket obviously isn't where Ford moved it up. There's a lot of things that start going, if they didn't put that trach tube in at that exact location, they went up a little bit higher, a little bit lower, it would have been easier to tell what wounds Kennedy had beforehand, before all that stuff was added in there. Because a lot of people, I mean, there's a big controversy whether that was an exit or an entrance wound in Kennedy's throat. So,
here's the problem you've got. The entrance wound was about here. It was above the shirt. It was just below the Adam's apple and just above what we call the sternal notch. I'll have to undo my tie to show you the sternal notch.
You're committed. Commit to it.
The sternal notch here. I'm really committed, right? So it's between here and here. You can't go above. If you go above the hole, then your tube is not going to make a good seal. And if you go below the hole, you're into the sternal notch. You're not close enough to the trachea, which lays closer to the skin here than it does here. So not only was it in the perfect place, you wouldn't go above or below it anyway.
So less conspiracy, more this is the exact medical procedure, just happened to be in a very good place.
And there's a lot of BS talked about obliterating the wound. How often have you heard that phrase? The wound was obliterated. It wasn't. It absolutely wasn't. And I think, much as I hate the autopsy photograph controversy, I don't want to get into it, but I mean, you can see on some of those autopsy photographs, at least one of them, that it would have been a relatively simple job to close that up and reform the wound. They didn't do that at Bethesda. Let's not go down the rabbit hole. They didn't do it at Bethesda because they didn't know it was a wound. They thought it was a tracheotomy because it was in the perfect place for one.
A trauma physician who has a patient, his job is not to preserve evidence. His job is to save that life. If you save that life, the necessity to have the evidence is diminished. The evidence monkey falls on the back of the forensic pathologist. So even if they, would have moved it, it's not their concern to preserve anything other than life itself. That's the most important thing. So we can't move that because a pathologist is going to need it later. They all knew he was going to die, but they've got the protocol that they go through. And that wound happened to fall right in line with where that protocol placed that tracheostomy incision.
Now, if there was a chance that Kennedy's wound were a little bit different and there was a chance of saving his life, would it have been out of character or normal procedure to try and remove the president and get him back onto Air Force One if there was a chance of saving him, or they would have let the autopsy perform there? It's a big hypothetical, but
I don't think that, you know, I don't think that any doctor would have advised that. They would have said, if you move him, you're going to kill him. You're saying basically if he had pulled through just slightly, would they have gone ahead and hauled butt for low field?
yeah.
Is that what I'm? No, I don't believe so.
No, I mean,
But
you're talking about a medevac almost, aren't you? If you're going to medevac him anywhere, it would have been to trauma in Parkland. That was the best place for it.
Then why didn't they let Earl Rose perform the autopsy?
I read or I came across something just overnight that to me blew me away because I interviewed Dr. Rose. It was a brief interview, but he was a very, very kind, gentle guy from, I believe he was from Iowa.
Smoked a pipe?
And yeah, he did. I think that just goes with the position. I don't know. But I asked him specifically about guns because the story has always been that he and Theron Ward, the Justice of the Peace, arrived at the same time. I didn't realize until last night that Earl Rose actually had an office in Parkland because he did J.D. Tippett's autopsy at Methodist. But apparently, Dr. Rose had an office which allowed him, he was on the hallway, and it allowed him to look down the hallway. And stuff's coming by here, and he looks out, and there's a casket being wheeled out. And this comes from Dr. Robert McClelland. Dr. Rose hops up and says, "Excuse me, it's my duty to inform you that this is a homicide occurring in Dallas County, and the autopsy must be done here by a forensic pathologist. I happen to be a forensic pathologist, so we're not going anywhere." At which case, according to Dr. Rose and what he told Dr. McClelland, and this is on a website called Plastic Reconstructive Surgery Journal, Dr. Rose stated that the man leading the casket was carrying a Thompson submachine gun. That's the first time Dr. Rose has ever specifically mentioned a firearm, to my knowledge. Now, people were tucking their jackets behind their holsters and stuff, but this is the only weapon in hand that he ever discussed. And he was walking with another gentleman who turned out to be Roy Kellerman. And Roy Kellerman took Dr. Rose, picked him up under the armpits, set him aside, set him down, shook his finger at him, and they went out the door. Now, where this comes from is, a couple hours after the treatment ended, it was McClelland, Baxter, Perry, and Paul Peters were sitting upstairs at a coffee pot at the nurse's station outside the operating rooms. And Earl Rose just walked up and he said, "You won't believe what just happened to me. I just had this encounter with the Secret Service." This was entirely new to me. I have always heard, including in Dr. Crenshaw's book, that there was this great shouting match. Aubrey Wright recounts in The Man Who Killed Kennedy this profane language going back and forth, and he was embarrassed for Jackie Kennedy. Earl Rose apparently told Dr. McClelland, and I have no reason to doubt McClelland because he's always been solid on everything he's told me, there was virtually no conversation. So I'm in a bit of a conundrum. I'm not sure what to believe on that anymore. But if that autopsy had been done in Dallas County, Dr. Rose, of course, having impeccable credentials, we wouldn't probably be having this conversation.
Yeah, I've heard the same story. And wasn't there also a justice of the peace who tried to stop the Secret Service? So that's maybe the thing that Aubrey Wright heard, and maybe the encounter with Rose was, a slightly different occasion further down the corridor. But certainly a lot of people, the autopsy was illegal. It wouldn't have been allowed as evidence in any case because it was taken away from where the body was murdered. Um, that's not the case. The judge would have to decide the weight that he gave to that evidence would have been greater had the autopsy been done in Dallas than it would as it was done in Washington. Um, so the legal part of it has got some nuance to it. But of course, Rose did all the other autopsies in the case. He autopsied Tippett, like you said. He autopsied Oswald, and he autopsied Ruby. So he did all the others, and all his records. I mean, they're all available at Oklahoma University, I think it is, University of Oklahoma. I've got the slides, copies of the slides that he made of Ruby's tissues, and I've got a whole bunch of stuff on all the other autopsies he did. And he was deeply interested in the case to the degree that he kept hundreds of newspaper clippings, anything that said Kennedy murder or anything to do with the controversies. He kept a clipping of, and he's got boxes of them at University of Oklahoma. A whole bunch of stuff that was very, very useful for my book. For instance, he kept copies of the drafts of the HSCA reports. And I'd never seen any drafts anywhere else before. I have copies of them, and I discuss them at length in my book, because they changed the reports and in a way that was favourable to the government.
So are those online, or did you have to go to the University of Oklahoma for that?
Yeah, they're not online. I mean, you have to go to the archivist, and you have to pay for them to be copied, and you have to know exactly which boxes to go to. But the references are in my box if you want to. In my book if you want to pursue that.
The reason why I've asked some of these kind of weird questions when it comes like a hypothetical and so like if Kennedy was alive, would the Secret Service have removed his body, or if this was the trach tube wasn't being put down in a pre-existing, is because I'm sure you guys have come across it doing the work that you've done for the medical evidence, but there's a lot of theories that end up being built, and a lot of them start to boil down, and you'll come across a lot of them as it's all for nefarious purposes. I think a lot of it can be explained with just the particular situation that they're in. There's also nefarious things that I can't explain with like doctors that didn't make statements later that could have easily just said something, but they've kept quiet for so long, or just people that were there that kept quiet for so long. That's a problem. I can't explain the number of witnesses that talked about seeing a hole in the windshield or sawing blood and brain matter and all this and bullet fragments in the limousine, which we'll get into a little bit. But I wanted to give a more, I think a lot of this can just be done. This is just how the situation was, and they were acting on hand with just the time and the pace and everything that was going on. So that's why I'm kind of focused into asking these little bit of kind of weird questions, just getting your perspective on it because of the many theories that do boil out there. This is what anybody's going to come across when they go and Google this for the first time. They're going to come across all these different ideas of what was going on. But when we talk about Earl Rose, the flashing of guns to him, the movement of the body, that can be put more in a conspiratorial nature, that they're trying to cover up what they did to Kennedy. I don't necessarily believe that. I believe it was a security issue where they had to get his wife Jackie on Air Force One, and she was not going to leave without the body, and Johnson was not going to leave without Jackie. So I think a lot of this can be put in terms, especially through the research you guys done. I'm sure you guys have come across the theories that a lot of this was just, I mean, in hindsight, you can Monday quarterback all you want and realize that there's a lot of issues that went on, but they were doing the best that they could at the time that they had. And when it comes to Earl Rose, I don't know why that he would say one thing and then maybe do another thing when it comes to the flashing of guns. That's a controversial area for me because I've seen statements saying that Secret Service pulled out their guns. And then I've heard Earl Rose himself telling, or in an interview saying it never happened, or from Brad Parker, your recollection that there was never that situation that happened. So it becomes more muddied when it comes to the historical record.
Certainly. And the gun thing, and I hate to do this because he was a close friend of mine. But unfortunately, a lot of the traction that the flashed gun story got came about, I believe, due to the publication of a book by Dr. Charles Crenshaw. His first book was called Conspiracy of Silence. And in that, he recounts a couple of different firearms incidents in the emergency room area. And I believe Dr. Crenshaw. I've sat across the table, and you can tell when the man talked, he believed what he was saying. But there is a distinct lack of corroborating witnesses in a few of his observations. Now, is that just like I was talking about earlier? Is that just a memory evolving? Did he convince himself of that? I don't know. He's unfortunately no longer with us to answer that kind of question. But, you know, he's the one that really put forth the thing that this was a borderline shooting. Like it was down to brass tacks. And I Crenshaw's book. I worked on his lawsuit with him. We would just send each other random things in the mail. And I hate to do this to the guy, but I've got to be truthful about it. Is that he's really kind of the lone guy that really says that, oh man, it came so close. They were screaming and yelling. And other than Aubrey Reich, I don't recall mentioning anything about firearms. He seemed to be hung up on the language.
I thought he'd still be paying attention to the seizure victim he picked up earlier.
Yeah. No, he's the
That
one that
will
brought
be
the
brought up.
casket out.
We're going to be talking about that. Yeah, I know he brought the casket.
Okay. But no, Dr. Crenshaw's book.
Sorry, I
I'm
was just
sorry, Russ.
Aubrey Wright was a Southern gentleman, wasn't he? Which is why he was concerned about the language, I think, rather than the weapons. I mean, if you're in Texas, everybody's got a weapon, right? So
Yeah, that's true. And I was raised much the same way. When you're in mixed company, watch your language. That's the way it is.
and I agree with what you said, and also with what Robbie said. I think, the new president, Johnson, decided that he wanted out of Dodge, and he wouldn't go without Jackie, and Jackie wouldn't go without the body. So they decided that it had to go. Now, once they start moving, the Secret Service, those that have got holstered weapons, are going to reveal those holsters because they want to get to those weapons quickly. The head of state has just been killed, and they're moving with the new head of state. They're very, very nervous guys at this stage. And weapons were already out, weren't they? Because the submachine gun that was hit into the face of the FBI man, for instance, now you don't carry that under your jacket. That's going to be out.
Can you explain that? Wait, so what happened exactly? Because I've heard you guys mention it before. I haven't exactly come across that account yet, but I would have to think that'd be a security issue. They're just worried about somebody coming in to Parkland Hospital when they're trying to lock it down, and then something happens, and next thing you know, someone gets hit in the face with a gun.
Yeah, Brad might know more about that than I do. I'll keep quiet.
Well, that's another one of the Crenshaw things that he had been in the emergency room, and he stepped out for something, and as he did, he noticed a security officer with a rifle, presumably the AR-15 that George Hickey produced in Dealey Plaza, the black gun that everyone's afraid of now. And as he's approaching the trauma room to re-enter after whatever errand he ran, the security agent sees someone who does not, or this gentleman does not believe belongs in the emergency room. And the guy kind of tries to get past him. And supposedly the agent took the rifle and wham, right across the jaw. And Dr. Crenshaw describes how the guy's eyes glazed over, and he said, in my mind at that moment, I knew that man's jaw was broken, but I had someone bleeding to death in the other room, so I went back to my patient. That's the only incident with the firearm striking someone that I'm aware of.
And I tend to believe what you said. I think the only long arms that were out were AR-15s. I don't know much about weapons, but I can't imagine the Secret Service having a Thompson submachine gun, one of those guns with the round mag on it. That's not the kind of weapon they would carry.
Unless they're connected to organized crime, and the HSC was
The
right about that. But
the Al Capone gun, yeah, they used to call it the Chicago typewriter. And the AR-15 had actually been adopted by Kennedy at the request of Curtis LeMay. So he was a big enthusiast, so he probably said, our detail needs some of those. So, you can see pictures of the limousine on Stemmons as they are headed to Parkland. And you've got Clint Hill in the foreground laying across the car. And in the background, you've got an agent ducking down and that's a very distinctive weapon. I've got one, and it's got a very distinctive profile. And it's clear that that's an AR-15. I mean, they're not going to be carrying shotguns or anything, or Thompsons or anything like that. It would be an AR.
I wanted to head more into the kind of anomaly aspect of Parkland Hospital, but Russell, a quick question for you. Did any of the investigations focus more on Parkland, or was a lot of the focus when it came later to where you can actually get a good breakdown of the wounds and areas that are messed up? I would think a lot of that would be focused on Bethesda, but the issues at Parkland, there, from some reports that I've read, they did chase down the seizure victim, and we could talk about him in a little bit, because obviously he's been a big controversy. Some people think that that was staged, or I don't necessarily think it was a stage thing. I think it was probably just real incident that happened. Now, it is suspicious that there are like at least 8 or 9 different police officers' accounts where they're like, I don't know when Kennedy was hit because I was paying attention to a seizure victim. I was like, yep, that's where the conspiracy thread will start to go. So I'm really trying to balance for people like ourselves that believe conspiracy. There is real conspiracy, but it's not everywhere. It's just there's areas that are a bit suspicious and a very good evidence to support that there's more evidence to support a cover up than trying to figure out who pulled the trigger. But I'm trying to give more definitive practice, because when someone goes and Googles Parkland, they're going to be able to have something there at least.
As usual, Robbie, a laser-like question about the Parkland hospital doctors rather than the Bethesda doctors. No, none of the reviews and none of the investigations really took the Parkland doctors seriously. And it began with the Warren Commission. It went through the HSCA, who talked to them as very much of an afterthought. You won't find much in the HSCA about the Parkland doctors, and the ARRB, same deal. They were secondary to the Bethesda doctors because the autopsy had to be, that was the government's position. That was the government's whole case. He was shot twice from behind. And the Parkland evidence simply doesn't confirm that. It doesn't support it. So Parkland doctors have always been sidelined. That's the way I would put it. What about you, Brad?
I think so as well. And Robbie was talking about anomalies. And I've heard it seems like just in the last couple years, people have talked about a left shot, like someone was on the south side of the triple underpass. And I think that really there's no evidence for that at all in the medical evidence. Besides that, if you're in that position firing, you run a risk of hitting Jackie. But there is an anomaly. Actually, there's 2 anomalies that people will pull out of context. And one of them is Father Oscar Huber, who came out after he did the last rites, and he was interviewed. And why a priest can give an interview about this, I don't know. But he said
Wait,
he
a
had
priest
a
gave an
wound.
interview about what he saw. Sorry to cut you off, but
Father Oscar Huber, who was the lead in giving the last rites at 1 o'clock, he went out and was asked by the throng of media, what did he look like? What happened? Anything we can get from you. And he said he had a nasty wound of the left temple. Now, okay, that's one guy, but no, there's a second. And I believe that this guy just is not that observant. It's Dr. Adolf Hartung Giesecke. Dr. Giesecke was an anesthesiologist, and when he testified for his deposition, he indicated that there was a wound from the crown of the head to what he called the apex of the left ear. Now, Spector did question him on this and said, "You're saying left ear?" And he said, "That's just my memory of it." Well, he also told a story later to a researcher, and I can't remember who it was. But when he walked in the room, Dr. Jenkins was at the head of the table by then. The tracheotomy was finished. McClelland is moved. Jenkins is at the head of the table. And as Kennedy's laying there, he is feeling for a temporal pulse. He's trying to find something. Well, there also happened to be blood there, as I'm sure there was blood many, many places. But Giesecke interpreted that. Apparently, I don't know if Jenkins looked up at him at that moment or what the deal was, but Giesecke took it that Jenkins was pointing out an injury. It probably looks right on the screen, but I'm pointing to my left temple. He thought that was the left side, and I'm afraid that colored Dr. Giesecke's view to where when he gets in front of Arlen Spector in, I believe, March or April, everything is moved to the left side. Now, I got a hold of Dr. Giesecke in early 93. What I did, I got him on the phone, and he said he didn't want to talk about it. And then what I did was I sent him the McClelland drawing from 6 Seconds in Dallas. The drawing that is, anybody that's familiar with my stuff know that drawing is pretty key to a lot of my research. But I sent it to him and I said, "Would you please comment? Is this anything like what you recall?" And what he wrote on the page was, "I would agree with Posner's findings," because that was right at the time that Posner was issuing his book, early 93. So, you've got the priest who made, I believe, a mistake. I don't believe there's anything on the left side.
sworn to
Nobody.
silence my ass. I can tell you that much.
Well,
Not giving a confession, I can tell you that.
those are two anomalies at Parkland that I think people can discount with a pretty high level of confidence. I believe they were totally incorrect.
You said that he wasn't that observant. Are we talking about like he had a lazy eye and he just probably didn't get the full detail, or he just
I don't know. His in his testimony in volume 6, he actually seems a little bit disinterested. He got drafted to, because Pepper Jenkins had Kennedy, I guess being the senior guy under Jenkins, he got drafted to go across the hall and run anesthesia for Governor Connally, and then go up to the OR suite and work there. And Dr. Jenkins ended up there eventually, I believe, as well. But he just doesn't seem like he's really in the moment at all. And it's only about a 3-page deposition, so you can read it fairly quickly.
I know I gave you guys a limited thing when it came to to kind of more conspiratorial? Is it military influence and people losing their careers about statements and stuff like that? But one thing I wanted to mention, Meatloaf is right about this, but when he mentioned his friend that was at Parkland, there I've seen the interview with his friend, and this becomes a large concern. I'll ask you more focused towards Earl Rose when it came to him doing the autopsy and issues of it leading to conspiracies and just having all the information together. But in this interview outside of Parkland Hospital with a 13-year-old boy, when he was asked, "What do you think about the president's death?" he goes, "Oh man, it's just rough. I mean, this is the last thing this state needs." Like they're more concerned about the reputation of Dallas, which obviously became later called the city of hate because of a lot of issues. But I would have to think with Earl Rose, I mean, how much weight do you guys put into that? Might have saved a lot of the reputation of Dallas when it came to that whole incident with Kennedy. I mean, that's got to be a factor you would have to put up there as well, too. I mean, if you're able to do the autopsy, give an official, well done one like the one we mentioned with Thomas Noguchi in the RFK autopsy, I mean, that's like a big reputation thing. It was like, yeah, that was the best known autopsy. But if we talk about Earl Rose doing the autopsy, that could have saved Dallas from being called the city of hate or just
Oh,
being.
definitely. And Russell can comment on this more because he has reviewed the other. I've seen the Tippett autopsy. I believe I got a copy of that from Brian Edwards years ago. But Tippett got him, and Oswald as well got absolutely followed the protocol, classroom type autopsies. Kennedy, what do we do? We move the wound 4 inches a few years later. I mean, it's ridiculous. To where no one is questioning Oswald's autopsy, no one's questioning J.D. Tippett's autopsy. There's some stuff about Tippett to question, but not the autopsy. I think that if Earl Rose had been allowed to do that and done as good a job as I believe he would have done, uh, Dallas was always going to get a bad rap because of that shooting. I mean, if it would have happened in Miami, it would have been Miami. If it had happened in Chicago, it would have been Chicago. But whatever town would take a hit. But, when the public at large doesn't really know where the autopsy was done, and yet they're saying that they don't even know where the wounds are. What kind of doctors do we have in this town? That a lot of people blame Parkland for that. And in fact, it had nothing to do with Parkland. And that's the very problem. And Russell can speak more to the types of autopsies that the other gentleman received.
Yeah, Brad, I think you're absolutely right. The other autopsies were there's no problem with them. They're absolutely as you'd expect them to be done by a gifted forensic pathologist who's an expert in gunshot wounds, which Earl Rose was, of course. The only criticism I'd have of Rose really is that he was on the HSCA panel, of course, and he totally bought into everything that they said. He had no criticism of any of the findings that the other doctors made, and nothing but criticism of Cyril Wecht. And I found that unbelievable that a man with his experience could look at those, well, compare the autopsy X-rays, the autopsy photographs, and the autopsy protocol, which don't support each other. They're not mutually supportable, and not find a problem with them. And yet he didn't. He was totally happy to go along with anything that the HSCA wanted to publish and sign his name to them. And I've got letters between Rose and the other doctors on that panel, which are, which show that he was totally happy to support the conclusions and how much they disliked Cyril Wecht. So that's my only criticism of him, and it wouldn't have been a professional criticism, of course.
Do you believe that there was less pressure or less press available at Parkland that were trying to get photos and things of that sort, that maybe more people would have been paid attention to detail and focus, and we wouldn't have this much controversy over the events that happened at Parkland?
I don't know. There was a Fort Worth Star Telegram reporter who managed for just a second to get ducked into trauma room 1, but he didn't take any pictures. In order to avoid controversy at Parkland, it boils down to the wounds. And they're not going to let pictures of John Kennedy laying on the gurney. And the only thing they didn't remove, standard procedure is they cut off all your clothes, everything, so that they don't miss a wound. They left the president's briefs in place out of respect. But you're not going to see any pictures of John Kennedy anywhere. Even if reporters had the opportunity to do that in those days. Now, you would see it today. But in those days, the press people did stuff like cover up affairs that they knew were going on. I mean, they looked out, tried to protect the dignity of the man, the office, whatever. And I don't believe that an intrepid photographer in the right place at the right time would have made a lick of difference.
Yeah, but when it comes to the presidential limousine, though, I mean, putting on the bubble top quickly, it seems like if you read a lot of those statements of people that were near the bubble top or involved with uh, the limousine when it was at Parkland, a lot of the concern was about the press taking photographs. Even like, don't let the press near take photographs. And I get it because it doesn't look good. But there was a large focus on that. I'm like, guys, I feel like there's bigger concerns than just the press getting a couple photographs. Now, the press is important for historical purposes for us, looking back. Amazing photos at Parkland, 100%. But there's a lot of issues where I'm like, hey, there's a lot of statements apparently from people talking about seeing brain matter and things and bullet fragments involved in the limousine. And then we see a bucket photo. A lot of that can be taken out of context for sure. Now, I believe that they started cleaning the limousine. I don't know how far they went, but obviously there's certain issues where fragments, if there were fragments inside the limousine, we'd have a more definitive account if, yes, there were fragments or no, there were not just a statement from an officer or a statement from an orderly or statement from somebody else, if they weren't so focused on the press taking photographs of the limousine.
I think the thing about protecting the limousine, having been a patrol officer and accident reconstructionist for 18 years, and I've been in on some stuff, some high profile stuff, but you're still one of the locals. And at Parkland, what do we have? We had Texas Department of Public Safety, the DPS troopers, Herschel Jacks among them. Those guys have nothing to do, so put them up guard in the car. And you see pictures of that. There's like four of them. I believe there were four assigned to the motorcade, and you'll see one on each corner of the car. I've never really seen pictures of people running up and snapping the back seat or anything. The back seat photos were taken at the White House garage later that night. But as far as Parkland, there could be photos out there, but like I said, in those days, the reporters had a little bit of common sense and a sense of decorum.
Well, there's statements from them at Parkland saying that somebody came up to them and threatened them that they couldn't take photos. I've made clips about some of them already, but there's a big concern about that.
But the thing I think, you could take a picture of a black car from afar, and you're really not going to see a tremendous amount of stuff.
They did, but some of these guys were really trying to go up there. As soon as Connally and Kennedy, as soon as they arrived, they jump out of the car trying to take photos of inside of the thing.
Yeah, but when you got a guy as big as Herschel Jacks coming at you with that Texas Stetson on, saying, "No, you don't, boy. Step back across the line."
He was a foot taller because of that hat.
Yeah, he didn't. He actually hated wearing Stetsons. He got assigned that for that motorcade. But he, those guys. You get Texas. There's something inherently intimidating about state troopers that the local guys don't have. And then you throw that in with the Secret Service guy out there, well, we've got a bucket. Oh, well, we've got to piece together the bubble top. You got all this stuff that I just don't see how someone could get pictures. And if they did, it's gonna be so messy that I don't believe you're really gonna know what you're looking at. I mean, there's gonna be skull fragments, there's gonna be bone tissue, everything's covered in blood. Um, and maybe there's a picture, maybe somebody got those pictures but decided to err on the side of, a little bit of common sense and not publish them.
Well, Henry Gonzalez is a good example. He was at Parkland. He took photos of a sheet draped over Kennedy. But apparently, he got his cameras taken out of his vehicle, and then ended up finding them getting fenced, and then all the footage and stuff was gone. Now, that doesn't have to be someone from the military took his footage. It could have just been some person realized, holy shit, I got photos of Kennedy at Parkland. I could sell this on whatever, and then that's why his footage wasn't there. But he was a member of the HSCA that didn't believe conspiracy, but he talked about his cameras and photos that he took at Parkland Hospital being taken.
Yeah,
Yeah. And
Weeks later, though, it wasn't like the day of.
sorry,
go
Brad.
ahead, Lester.
No, I was just going to say, I think there's two things that occur to me about photographs at Parkland of JFK himself in Trauma Room 1. Well, if they're hitting people from the FBI in the face with a weapon, trying to get into the area, there's nobody with a camera is going to get by that. And the second thing is, even the doctors wouldn't allow people in because there's such thing as patient confidentiality. You just don't allow people to take pictures of surgical procedures. So that's what makes me think there was never any possibility of photographs of JFK in Trauma Room 1. And then of the limousine itself, and I can only agree with everything that Brad said about the security of the limousine, but people just didn't, apart from press, nobody really carried a camera every day. And if they did, it was a black and white camera. So shots you were going to get of the interior of the car are not going to show, the difference between blood and brain tissue or bone tissue. It would have all looked pretty much the same color. The only reason I can think they would have taken a bucket to the car, the Secret Service, was if you want to put the bubble top back on, you've got to have the places where the bubble top attaches. You've got to have those clean of materials. So maybe they were just going to clean out those areas.
Yeah,
It
but
may
an
not
orderly said to grab a bucket and all that to clean out the limo. So that's why that would be there.
Well, yeah, I mean, it's cleaning out the limo, but it's not throwing the bucket on the back seat. It's taking a sponge and cleaning out those small areas where you need the bubble top to attach.
I thought they were planning on reusing the limousine, even though that
No,
just
but
sounds
they want the
ridiculous.
top on so to preserve the scene. I mean, the Secret Service have got a duty there as well to
See,
preserve the scene of the.
I'm more in belief that they were in shock and nobody was acting right. So that's why they were cleaning out the limo thinking that Kennedy was going to be fine. Because you see statements, there are people that said nobody brought a bucket out there. I'm like, well, there's a photo of it. So
There's photo.
I
No,
mean,
no
like I said,
supposition.
a
Who
lot of
knows?
areas for this, like Secret Service, a lot of them should have lost their job. Not that they had the time, there's enough time for them to react, but they were drinking the night before. Now, if this is a common thing among Secret Service, that's in their rule book that's immediately you're getting fired. So there was a lot of denial of these certain things happening, or we didn't want to hurt their reputation, so we kept them on. There's a lot of things where statements can then be influenced with that same factor of we never put a bucket out there. Nobody ever touched the limousine to clean it up. I tend to I can't really trust you because you've lied in the past already. So for me, I guess that maybe I'm more conspiratorial when it comes to the limo. Mostly because I think there's statements from bullet fragments, and I think there's even photos that we have of like the rear above the rear view. There was a dent there from a bullet thing. There's a lot of things, skull fragments that were found later on the C-130 plane of in the limousine when it was being carried back. And then later, Walter Evans, who was never interviewed by the Warren Commission, never interviewed by the FBI. He was just he was a WFAA reporter who arrived at the Texas School Book Depository at 7 o'clock p.m. And at 7:30, he's talking to an officer, and a person comes up with a skull fragment. I found this in the street. They're like, holy crap, yeah, I'll get that. Where did that go? We don't know. Nobody knows. So there's a lot of issues when it comes to statements, and there's press, and the press played an important factor for sure. But I also believe it was influential in really taking a lot of people's attention off certain areas where they should have been focused. Much like Jerry Belknap, the seizure victim. Let's get into that guy. Guy has a seizure, what, 20, 30 minutes before, and everybody starts saying it was a fake thing because he, left the hospital without signing his name or doing anything like that. I'm less conspiratorial on that. But I will say there's a lot of statements from Dallas police officers that talked about they didn't know what was happening with the shooting because their attention was focused on this victim that was having an epileptic seizure. So, what are your thoughts on Jerry Belknap? Come on, give it to me. Let's hear it.
The thing is, there is that, being a former cop, I'm drawn to the radio tapes and stuff, and then there's transcripts of those, which you really kind of need because some of them sound like the microphones in their mouth. And I believe that 606, which was Aubrey Reich's hearse slash limousine, in those days, an ambulance was an attendant and an oxygen bottle in the back with the patient. Um, they left at about 12:20 and headed for Parkland. They radioed in to dispatch and said, "We're headed for Parkland." Those officers were no longer occupied with that. If they're using that as some type of diversion thing of, geez, I was sidetracked, they're off by 10 minutes.
But the conspiratorial point is perhaps that that occurred 10 or 20 minutes before the shooting, which allowed the shooters to get into place without being seen by the cops.
And you're familiar with Aubrey Reich's belief that they'd been timed, correct?
Yeah.
Oh, that was because of the prior ambulance calls to Dealey Plaza.
Several calls to the Dealey Plaza area in the weeks prior to the shooting. So where in retrospect, and he became a cop, so he becomes when you're in that line of work, as I was for so long, you kind of start second guessing things and finding maybe this wasn't what it appeared to be. Maybe it was a huge coincidence. Downtown is a very big area with a lot of people. Maybe it was completely harmless, and Aubrey Reich is way off base with his suggestion that possibly they were being timed. Now, he wasn't 100% convinced. He just says, it has crossed my mind that we were being timed.
Well, typically, if it's more conspiratorial, you wouldn't have what the Warren Commission did, which was they pursued it. They interviewed somebody, found out the name of the guy, then interviewed the guy, and then they kind of hammered out that detail in the report. If it was something where it was just this person showed up and then left and all this would have happened and they would have never pursued it, I would have put more weight in the conspiracy aspect of it. Now, it is weird the ambulance calls happening, though. But the cops that were interviewed that went to that, and there were a lot of Dallas police officers that were just standing by or whatever, the ones that were interviewed, they never were, that was their only test statement about the JFK assassination, not what they saw in Dealey Plaza. They were just like, I was focused on this seizure victim. I was like, do you have another one? Is it just this one? That's all you gave, was you were paying attention to a seizure victim? What about the 10 minutes later or the 20 minutes later when the shooting occurred or whatever? And they're like, nah, my only thing of that day was, I got a Klondike bar and then there's a seizure victim that happened. And I was like, well, thanks, man. That was a great statement.
Yeah, DV Harkness was the guy kind of running the show there, and he didn't seem all that concerned. I remember many times being on site on ambulance calls and saying, you might want to tell them to step it up. This is not looking good. There was never anything like that from the scene. They just said, we need an ambulance element here, some possible seizure. And that was pretty much it. They're like 606, your ambulance is 4 blocks out. Okay. They don't care. You can't tell me that you've got a huddle of cops standing around this guy on the ground that engrossed. And Russell's absolutely right. The timing that if the motorcade's running late anyway, which someone who was going to do what these people were going to do would know that. The timing was perfect to let people slide into positions, wherever they may be, to divert the crowd's attention and then get in. And you're going to be able to get out because everyone's going to be freaking out afterward. So
So you
that's
want to debunk it, but then there's like shit. You got the Umbrella Man. You got what
it's tough.
Jerry Dolan, who's throwing a ball up in the. He's a grown ass man throwing a ball up in the air when the president's arriving. That is weird to me. And a lot of people might not think it's weird, but I don't know. I just don't. Even if you're bored sitting in traffic, it's like I feel like there's a million other things you could have been doing. It would have been like if you would have sat down, sort of picking up leaves of grass and trying to blow into it and make a whistle noise out of it. I would question your activities if you're above the age of 20. That is just something, but there's a lot of things like this that happened in Dealey Plaza. And if we're focusing back onto Parkland, I mean, what do you guys think about the Malcolm Kilduff announcement of President Kennedy's death? Whether you think it was interesting, or did it lead more into the bad part of conspiracy, or did it give weight to evidence that there was something else going on there? Obviously, he made this statement where he points like this to his head. I kind of look at his interview later. He gave an oral history interview that's very interesting. He doubts the single bullet theory, but his main concern was, how come the Warren Commission never called me to be a witness or to even like give questioning? Like hearing him say that, like he's like, he even talks about it. I don't believe the conspiracy stuff, but he was like, one man misses the car by that much and then hits 2 times on the thing. And I'm like, well, look, now when I look at the photos of him, I'm like, you know what? I respect you a little bit more. I wish you would have said it at the time. But, later's fine too.
I tend to think that someone, I don't believe that he was brought in and briefed on precisely the type of injuries that Kennedy had. I believe that they said, you need to get out there and tell him the president was shot. And he probably said, shot where? And they said, shot in the head. And I'm assuming the guy's right handed because, whatever the percentage of the population is. But I think he just did this to emphasize it was a head injury. I don't, it's
Me
not
too.
like he went, it was this and then it was this. I don't believe that it carried any significant weight. It just so happens that it roughly coincides.
Agreed. Absolutely.
Do you think it played a significant importance of Malcolm Kilduff? I mean, that whole situation with him giving the speech to the press or letting the press know about Kennedy's death? Because I think Nellie Connolly gave an interview too.
I think the people that wanted to pick up and run with it did. And the rest of us, maybe, and Russell's agreeing with me, so I'm going to lump him in with me. I hope that's okay. But the rest of us who kind of went, I think the guy is just trying to indicate, maybe for those who have the sound down on their TV, that the president was hit in the head. I don't think that it was meant to be a hint of anything, but people take it that way because they want to. This is one of those cases, probably the biggest case in the world, where people cherry pick evidence to fit exactly what they want. And there's a lot of cases like that, but this is the granddaddy of them all, really. That the people that wanted to say, yeah, it was the right, he's pointing exactly where he was shot. Well, that's not correct because nobody else except Dr. Crenshaw saw an injury in this area. Everyone else just saw the back half gone. What Crenshaw saw, I don't know. I tend to wonder if it was a blood clot. Um, but
Because, I mean, the physician were talking about linking the two wounds, weren't they? The throat wound here and the exit here. They certainly Perry was thinking that it went straight through. They were the only two wounds that.
Dr. Jones told me, he said, we had no history of anything. He was just there. My thought was he'd been out at the airport, maybe shaking hands, and somebody took a handgun, popped him in the throat from a downward angle, and it went out that way. Now, if you look at I believe it was the first attempt on Joe Ford, September 1975, by Squeaky Fromm with a Colt 45, that is exactly the scenario. The only thing that saved Joe Ford was Squeaky Fromm was so illiterate with weapons, she didn't chamber around. So the speculation that these doctors had was it almost happened to Ford, oddly enough. But they all thought they were trying to tie this with this, and they didn't know anything about a back wound. And I genuinely believe that there was a back wound much lower, because one of the agents in the follow-up car saw him struck. But
And there's holes in the
they
clothing.
yes, yeah. You know, they just didn't know quite how to piece things together. And really, it was just passing speculation. Again, it's not their job to figure out where the round came from or anything. Their job is to save a life. They know that they don't have to worry about this, because in a little bit, when the president inevitably dies, he's going to be wheeled down the hall, and Dr. Rose is going to work his magic. That's their belief at the moment.
What you've mentioned this, Brad, but you mentioned McClellan seeing a guy with a football.
Well, the foot
I've
the
never
football.
heard
I
that
should have put
before.
the
Was that
the
soft?
football. No, it's
Just checking.
He sent it on
it's not
Messenger,
your
so if I took it out of context, I don't know, but I got to figure it out
no
now.
no no. What it is the president travels everywhere with a military aide. That military aide may be in uniform. He may be in plain clothes. He's carrying a briefcase, a very large, overgrown briefcase, although I'm sure it's smaller now than it was in 1963. That briefcase is handcuffed to this high ranking military advisor. What it is you open this thing up and it tells you step by step the codes to enter to launch nuclear weapons. This is a do it yourself nuclear war kit.
Is that what you meant by football?
And that's what they call it. They call it the
Dude, I'm
nuclear
sitting here
football.
thinking there's an NFL athlete at Parkland Hospital. I mean, Meatloaf's already
No,
there.
no,
That's
no. It's called
insane.
the
Wow.
no, and the McClellan says, it's so strange that this man walks in, and he knew what it was. I mean, it's never really been any secret that the president travels with the guy with the briefcase with the codes, and the code name for it's the football. But he says, the guy steps in the door and steps aside, and he's standing there handcuffed to this briefcase. When the man, in fact, who should have had the football at his disposal, is in major medicine in a locked room being heavily guarded, which just goes to show that, these are all Kennedy people. These are not Johnson people. These people were all appointed by Kennedy. I believe the gentleman would have been General Godfrey McHugh. But he believed that his president was still a viable entity to launch a nuke if needed. But it should have been over in Johnson's area, because, as Dr. McClellan pointed out in the interview, we didn't know if this was a preemptive strike right before a nuclear war began. We had no idea. But he said, I did notice the guy with the football.
Guy's got brain damage. You're going to let him launch a nuke? Man, it's not that much different than what we're dealing with today, I guess.
Well,
Um, sorry. Had to.
no, you're good. You're good. You're good.
That was a good
Told you
evidence
were.
of conspiracy right there. Talk about people's interviews getting taken out of context. Because if I would have just transcribed that and put that on a transcript of our messenger conversation, they'd be like, "There was a guy with a football at Parkland." I was like, "Shit."
Yeah. Must have a flechette in it.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, yeah. Um,
Yes.
kind of heading back onto the more serious aspect of Parkland Hospital. I mean, through your guys, obviously, foray into this thing and writing your books about the medical evidence and focusing in on that. I mean, when you're trying to stress areas of Parkland to any new researcher or anyone that would be looking into Parkland for the first time or just coming across the case, could you guys maybe give your opinion on Parkland and why it is important? But when it comes to specifically, there's real conspiracy and there's real, like, just things that get taken out of context. Obviously, this has kind of been the focus of the conversation. But when we're talking about just finding a fine line of things that were things to be able to question and things that can obviously be taken and ran off with, just from your personal perspectives. Russell, if you want to go first, and then Brad will hear from you.
Sure. Well, Parkland's important because the doctors there had no axe to grind. They are just dealing with what's been put in front of them, and their job is to save the man's life. They have no background. They have no way they could be part of any conspiracy. And the things that they recorded, especially in their admission notes and their interviews shortly afterwards, are the best. They're the first day evidence. And you've heard all about on crime scene reconstructions and on cop shows how important that not only the first day evidence, but the first hour, the golden hour evidence. And they were the people in the golden hour. And I just keep it as short as that and say these people recorded what happened at the time and had no reason to lie about it.
And where I would send people to back up what Russell's saying is I would send them to the commission exhibit of those contemporaneous reports done that day, the day after, and then again to volume 6 of the Warren hearings. And then let them read the autopsy report, and you can see why they're so different. I learned that, I give speeches on this. I've got one I'm watching on YouTube. I'm watching the views go up. But I tell people, this language is not difficult to learn. You get yourself a copy of Gray's Anatomy like I did, and you just learn what bone is where. I mean, that's what I did in 1992, Robbie. We didn't have the internet those days. but that's, you learn the terminology so that when you read the report, oh, hey, there was cerebellum hanging out of the wound. What's the cerebellum? Oh, that's what it is. Okay. Just a little bit of basic knowledge like that. And that alone, if people are open-minded at all, should show them, hey, we don't know where, we don't know why, but there is a problem. And that's I think where most new people should, if you're interested in starting with medical, that's what they should do.
And here's the
I want to tell
granddaddy.
you a story about how I learnt about the skull bones when I was at university. And I had to look at all kinds of skulls, but I didn't know one bone from another. I hadn't bothered to learn it. And during one of the classes, a professor came round to me and she pointed to some random bone on the skull. And she said, now, Mr. Kent, which bone is this? And I just guessed, frontal. And she said, back to kindergarten with you, Mr. Kent. Oh no. That day, I got my anatomy books out and I learnt the skull bones. There's not that many of them.
I only got a few more questions for you, but I got one that might be more controversial. But Ruby at Parkland. Do you guys believe that Ruby was at Parkland Hospital?
I do.
Okay.
I believe too. Seth Cantor was correct. Seth Cantor was a top-notch reporter. And in the interviews that I've seen with him, he has no credibility issues whatsoever. He was clear-minded. He knew Jack Ruby, and he knew who he'd just spoken to.
I go with Brad. I mean, he was everywhere else that weekend.
And I want to ask you guys about the magic bullet. Obviously, the person that came out recently, Landis, talking about finding the magic bullet on the stretcher compared to the person that was first attributed to finding the bullet on this stretcher. I mean, what are your guys' thoughts on the finding of the bullet? And I see Brad shaking his head.
Russell could start this one.
Okay. Well, I mean, I saw Landis talk about this in Pittsburgh last November. He's an old guy, and I don't know that I mean, I don't believe he did find the bullet on on JFK's stretcher. So that I'll come right out and say, I just don't think he did. Any bullet they found that day, well, there's just so many things wrong with the single bullet theory. And I don't believe the bullet that was found in Parkland Hospital went through either of the guys necessarily. Certainly didn't go through both of them. And I think there were, this comes down to a really simple thing to me. If the bullet didn't go through JFK's neck from the back to the front, then there is no single bullet theory. And this was an entrance wound, in my opinion. So the single bullet theory falls flat on the first wound. I'm going to leave it at that because, there's a hell of a lot of ways to disprove the single bullet theory. But if you believe this is an entrance wound, and I do, then the single bullet falls on that wound.
Two things on the single bullet theory. Mr. Landis, I've never spoken to him. Mr. Palomaro would be the one to refer to with regard to that. But as I understand it, the bullet was on the car, like at the back of the seat. Is that correct?
That's how Landis said he found it.
Okay. Well, you're driving probably in excess of 100 miles an hour. That's when they built big cars which would run. And you got Clint Hill flopping around on the back of this thing, holding on. Even if the bullet somehow managed to make it there, it's going to get lost on the freeway.
Oh, man, I've left my coffee on top of my car going 70 before, and it was still there. It was cold, but it was there.
Coffee's got a little weight to it.
I'm just messing.
The other thing I would like to point out, and Russell was talking earlier about, like the abrasion collar, how that works with bullets going in and scalding the skin as it goes in. Just kind of to go back just for a second, when I interviewed Dr. Robert Roeder Shaw, who was chief of thoracic surgery at Parkland that day, he indicated to me, his exact words were, "I've never believed the single bullet theory." Now, I asked him about the governor's wounds, and he said all of Governor Connally's wounds were caused by one bullet, but it was not the same bullet that struck John Kennedy. But as far as Mr. Landis, with all due respect to the gentleman, and I obviously someone who is the type of character that would take on that kind of a job deserves a lot of respect just for doing it. So I don't mean to deride his character, but I have trouble with that story.
What about the interview of Governor Connally at the hospital and his statements about not being hit by the same bullet? And also, do you think that he was a help or hurt to the kind of conspiracy aspect of the Kennedy assassination? Because obviously Warren Commission could have easily just not talked to him and just kind of been like, oh, he doesn't know what he's talking about. But that's the same thing with like RFK and Paul Schrade. You have people that say, Paul Schrade didn't know what he was talking about, that he wasn't hit by the same bullet or hit by the same shooter that RFK was hit by because he was hit in the head. He had brain damage. But if it would have went the opposite way and Paul Schrade would have said that it was Sirhan and he wasn't trying to fight for his innocence, they would have been like, he's a war hero. So when it comes to Connally made statements that he wasn't hit by the same. We would easily have an answer if we were able to just exhume him and dig up the fragments that he had left in his wrist. But Nellie didn't want that happening. But obviously his statements became an open door for conspiracy as well, too, which I think is important. I think he was correct. But obviously I can't pick and choose what conspiracies I want to believe and which ones I can't.
No, Connally is one, though, that has a little bit more expertise than, and I mean no disrespect, than, for instance, the lady standing out in front of the depository. Connally had been an avid hunter. Okay. He knew what a rifle sounded like. He heard a rifle shot, he turns around, can't see anything, turns this way, and then he's struck. To me, that's pretty solid. When you've got a hunter giving you a description like that. This is a gentleman who knows firearms very well. And although the Warren Commission said we believe the governor is mistaken in his conclusions, I think most of us that have looked at even just the Zapruder film know that's not correct. But you can also look at the medical evidence and find that that's not correct, because the back wound, which the HSCA privately indicated was rising at 11 degrees, according to Wecht and Baden, according to you guys last night, in fact, or Tim was it Tim Wright you had on? Tim Smith, yeah. He mentioned that he'd spoken that. But let's just say you have a round that goes like this, okay? And it's perfectly lined up with the Gerald Ford move in it and all. By the time it gets to Connally, it has now changed angles. It is now going at 27 degrees relative to the body axis. So the bullet had to come out. And then, even if Connally is lined up perfectly to take that next hit, the angle is wrong. So I believe Governor Connally knew what he was talking about. He was hit by a second round, and that round did not come from the depository. But, just like with Seth Cantor, they said, we simply don't find reason to believe his testimony. You can do that to a governor of Texas? Seriously? I mean,
I think the thing with the Connolly wounding, and I've looked at it in quite some detail. But it's a long time ago that I looked at it now. But in a way, it's a good thing that we have Connolly, because if you believe like I do that the entrance wound in JFK was here, then that represents one shot. The head wound represents two. The wound into Connolly is at least one more bullet, possibly three. So now we have three, correct. And the wounding to Tippett, now we've got 4 bullets. So it couldn't possibly be Oswald. So, you just got to add these things up. I don't know whether the governor was hit by one or more bullets, but I'd go with Shaw. If he thinks it's one, I'd go with him, because he was exemplary. The work that he did and the notes that he took, and the write up of the operation that he did on Connolly was exceptional. And same for Gregory. Although I actually believe that the trajectory through the wrist was this side to this side, which makes it a little awkward to come out of the chest and go through the wrist. So I think that there's evidence that he was hit with 2 bullets, Connolly, 2 bullets from different weapons with different trajectories, and certainly different speeds of bullets, because the wrist would have been blown off by a rifle shot. So, we could really get into Connolly if I was to reread all the papers I wrote on it and the chapter I wrote on it. But yeah, I definitely think that his wounding is critical to understanding that there were more than 3 shots.
I'm going to give you guys a minute here to be able to promote your links where people can find any of your current work or just any of your old work. When it comes to books, obviously Amazon's a good example of where people can probably find some of this material. But before I ask for your guys' links, you guys can add it on to this question here. But the importance for you of looking at the medical evidence. We've been talking about the importance of just looking at Parkland and what's important to the people that would be out there looking at this thing. But the reason you did it, really tried to do the work that you have done. Obviously, it takes a lot of time, whether you're making clips for YouTube like me, or whether you're digging up interviews and going through phone books, trying to contact people, or looking at various investigations that came and trying to find, what the answer is or where things differ. It takes a lot of your time, and it also takes a lot of weight onto your mind as well too, especially if you believe conspiracy and you believe that something is not right here and you have to question the official narrative. But what was the importance for you to do this? And then also, if you wanted to add on your links at the ending of that.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, the reason that I got into it was the JFK film, I suppose, the 1991 JFK film. Shortly before that came out, there was a lot of press saying how the film was terrible and was absolutely wrong, even before the film had come out. And I may have told this story before on your show, Robbie, but I was working in Holland at the time, in the Netherlands, and there was a fantastic American bookshop in Amsterdam, and these are the days before Amazon. So I went to the bookshop and I bought every book that I could find on the Kennedy assassination, and read them at the same time as the film came out. And I went to see the film in Holland. Luckily, they show their films in the original language, so it was shown in English, um, which was a damn good thing because my Dutch isn't fantastic. And so that's how I got into it. And I just, I accept. I think the film shows very clearly that the wounding in Parkland is not the wounding that was described in the autopsy. And then there's all the stuff with Oswald as well, which is very interesting too. So that's how I got into it, and I wrote to I think it was called the Assassination Research Center in Dallas.
Oh,
And
AARC.
yes, that's right. And they put me in touch with a group in the European group, which was based in London. So I then got in touch with them and started to go to their meetings and make presentations and write in their journal. And I wrote in the American journals and eventually started to write books myself. My links, you can find my Instagram, Russell underscore Kent underscore author, Russell Kent author. And my website, well, it's linked on there anyway, but it's Russell Kent, all one word, /my.canva.site. And that's where you can find me, apart from on your show, which I'm happy to be on again. Thank you, Robbie.
Brad?
Over to you, Brad.
Yeah.
Okay. I started, I read the Warren Report, and then I read Best Evidence, or not Best Evidence. I read Rush to Judgment, and then I think it was Best Evidence, 6 Seconds in Dallas. And I was just getting more and more confused. So I started calling. I had a friend in Dallas at the time who mailed me a Dallas phone book, and he made it possible for me to start harassing people on the phone. So I started making calls, and I got everywhere from I heard 1 or 2 shots to one gentleman told me he thought it was possibly even an automatic weapon, and he heard maybe 11 shots. I decided there's no way I'm going to get any kind of consensus with this. So I need trained observers. Well, the cops are going to have unlisted phone numbers. So who's a trained observer? Doctors. So, and most of them were still practicing at that time. So they had published phone numbers. Most of them were still at UT Southwestern Medical School and Parkland. And Malcolm Perry had a little trouble locating. He was in Amarillo at the time, but no, he's in Lubbock. But it became a matter of these are the guys because they are calm under pressure. They're treating this like any other patient. They're not rattled. They're just doing what they're trained to do. It's like muscle memory for them. And that's how I landed on medical evidence. And I still believe that it is far more clear cut than, and it's pretty murky, but I still believe that it's far more clear cut than if you're just comparing plaza witness statements. You want somebody that heard 10 shots, you can find somebody. You want somebody that heard no shots, you can find somebody. I mean, it's insane. So that's how I ended up there. And then, of course, that led to Bethesda and some other stuff that way. But Parkland is really kind of the heart of the case for me. My links, my book, and there's a gentleman in Dallas. who is constantly asking me for a hard copy of my book, which is no longer available. It is available as a CD-ROM from
I should get
JFK
a book
Land.
before he gets a book.
There are no more to be had. I mean, they sent me a limited number of them when it was published, and by the time every relative comes out of the woodwork, and you got a girlfriend here and a girl, they disappear. But
Same for me. Mine's not available anymore. I do. I mean, Medical Betrayal is available on Amazon as an ebook.
Yeah, you can get an ebook.
yeah, yeah. Now my ebook, if you look at my original, the PDF on the CD, and I'm gonna promote this CD, not because I get anything off of it, but because on the CD-ROM of my book, you get the PDF of the text, and then you get me introducing Ron Jones, and you get a 90-minute talk from Ron Jones himself. You can hear the gentleman himself tell the story. That is worth $12.50 or whatever it is to hear Ron Jones talk for an hour and a half. That is worth the price of admission right there. But my book contained a number of charts, which were columns. And when they put that, I had a friend suddenly come in one day and said, I just got your book on Kindle. And I said, I'm on Kindle? What are you, crazy? And he said, no, you're on Kindle. Said, let me look at these charts. And the charts translated horribly. And I really was disappointed in that. But the text, the articles that I wrote, Dr. McClellan, Dr. Jones, there's one in there that's never been in a journal called Subjective Degree of Medical Certainty. My remembrance of Dr. Crenshaw, all that stuff is in the book that you can get from Amazon as a Kindle. And that's all I've got for links. I'm pretty linkless.
Gentlemen, I do appreciate the time you've given me on separate episodes and also for this one as well too. If you guys are open to it, we'll do a part 2 and we'll do Bethesda this time. That one's a little bit more tricky and fun because you're dealing with a lot of issues there. But I wanted to get the importance of Parkland out there because a lot of people tend to either gloss over it and get to Bethesda, maybe because that has the more interesting details on some things. But I think it's still important to the historical record. And a lot of this historical record is getting lost. Whether it's something like Jerry Belknap, a seizure victim, that'll end up being something that's not talked about. And I know you go, well, it's a rabbit hole. It's not even a rabbit hole. It's a significant detail about that event. Has nothing to do with no conspiracy. It's just something that happened that day, like Meatloaf being there. It's not important, but it's just interesting. And I have a clip of it on my YouTube. Anyone can look at it as a reference. It's an unidentified reporter, Asian reporter that's there. Nobody knows who that guy's name is. I didn't even see him in the footage. And then I'm looking back and I guess we must have just glossed over him, but he interviewed Henry Wade and we don't have his name. Where did that guy go? That's a big issue. Russell, I see your look on your face. I'll send it to you after this, and you can try and tell me if you've ever identified that man. I've never seen him before.
On a neutral look then, but it obviously didn't work.
There's a lot that gets lost, and eventually with time, and we're going up on 61 years, and only think what's going to be like in the next 10 years. There's going to be a lot of details that are going to be missing, which is why it's important to get people on the record. It's important to get people talking more about the assassination and doing more research, even though there's been a lot that's been done. And I appreciate the work that you two have done and the time you've given me to help me kind of walk me through Parkland and some of the medical evidence through the conversations that we've had. It's been a pleasure speaking with you and knowing you guys all this time. And thank you, everybody, for listening to this episode of Out of the Blank. Stay tuned for our next episode.